please join me in warmly welcoming Professor Karima Bennoune.
Thank you so much. Good morning. And let me first thank Reverend Sachs for that incredibly kind introduction, one of the nicest I have ever been given. And let me thank all of you for being here. I really have to say that the fact that so many people will give up one of the last summer Saturdays to talk about ideas is something that really inspires me. And so I thank you so much for your presence and for the invitation to be here. And let me thank in particular the techs, Taylor and Maria. And I'd also like to thank the people who kindly hosted me yesterday, Ken and Estelle Alexander, as well as Tom and Joanne Maples, who came all the way to the airport to pick me up. And I always say, you know, I'm half descended from Midwestern farmers from Ohio and Michigan and half descended from North African peasants. And these are two traditions that really rely on hospitality. And so when I'm in places like this, where the hospitality is so warm, I feel very much at home. So thank you for that. And it's really a privilege to be here at the University of North Georgia, to be a part of the Mountaintop Lectures series. I think what you do to promote dialogue about difficult issues, not shying away from those difficult issues, has never been so needed. And I'm really learning from you and what you're doing, and would love to see this model replicated elsewhere. I particularly thank the organizers for inviting me to speak about the topics that I will be addressing today, because they're not easy subjects. They're controversial subjects. In fact, I often wish I could work on something else, and I'll explain later on in the day why it is that I ended up working on these topics. But I sometimes joke that I'd like to become a florist. These are not easy subjects. And I keep hoping somehow that they will become less relevant and that I can travel and talk about something else. But instead, unfortunately, what we are seeing is that the topics of fundamentalism and extremism are very topical, perhaps more topical now than ever. So I think our gathering to work through these issues together in dialogue is incredibly significant. It's also a very wonderful way to commemorate something very important, which is the first ever International Day commemorating the victims of acts of violence based on religion or belief, which was just held around the world on August 22nd, on Thursday. This was a day created by the UN General Assembly, marked for the first time this year. And on that day, a group of UN human rights experts issued a statement calling for an increase, amongst other things, of interreligious, interfaith, and intercultural initiatives, as well as human rights education. And so I think what you're doing here really is in that spirit. And again, I really salute you for your efforts in this regard, and I'm very honored to take part in those and to mark with you that very important occasion marked around the world on the 22nd of August. Sort of a sad occasion, but nevertheless very important, the day commemorating the victims of acts of violence based on religion or belief. So today, in that vein, I'm going to give 3 lectures addressing different aspects of fundamentalism and extremism. The first lecture, as you see this morning, will be really the introductory presentation, and it's entitled Responding to the Global Rise in Fundamentalism and Extremism, and I will look at these issues from a human rights perspective, which is, as Reverend Sachs mentioned, the area in which I work. And I'm going to try to provide a global perspective on the rise of fundamentalism and extremism as I see it. The second presentation, very much building on the first, will look in depth at one particular manifestation of the problem, and it is only one manifestation of a much broader problem. But it's an issue that I've worked on a great deal, and that is the challenge of Muslim fundamentalism. But particularly, I want to look at that through the lens of the many people of Muslim heritage, women and men around the world, who have been working against fundamentalism and extremism. And we don't hear very much about them. They are the topic of my book. Your fatwa does not apply here, and I am so grateful to the organizers that they have the book here so I can literally share those stories with you in print as well. And finally, in my third talk, I am going to look at the particular impact of fundamentalism and extremism on women and the human rights of women, which is something that I have been working on at the UN level around the world. And I'm going to end that lecture trying to draw together some of the themes from the entire day, but particularly with a reflection on the importance of hope in the face of hate. And I hope that that really will be a theme throughout the day. I think it is such a critically important piece of this discussion, hope in the face of hate. Now, let me say on a brief technical note that I am speaking in my personal capacity today, which enables me to talk to you and with you as Professor Bennoune and to speak very freely in that regard. So that's my plan for our Saturday together. And let me just give you a little bit of an overview of what I'd like to do this morning. So I'm going to start by explaining why I think these topics of fundamentalism and extremism are such critical subjects for discussion today, and why I think they just require such an urgent global response. I'm then going to explain what I mean by the terms fundamentalism and extremism. They are, of course, contested terms. I'm going to describe the impact of these ideologies and the violence to which they give rise on human rights around the world, providing some examples. Unfortunately, there are many other examples that could be given as well. And perhaps most importantly, I'm going to try to outline a strategy for responding to fundamentalism and extremism with a human rights approach. And I've already been hearing the question, what can I do in regard to these issues? And I think that that really is the critical question. I'm also very committed to making sure that we have plenty of time for discussion, as I'm sure that many of you have your own views to share about these issues. And I think that there may be points where you agree with me, where you may disagree with me, even strongly, and I really welcome the chance to talk about our points of agreement and disagreement, and the ways forward, and the things that I haven't been able to cover in the lecture. So very much looking forward to the discussion. And I wanted to say that I am especially honored when I have the opportunity to dialogue with people who may have different views about these topics, because I think those dialogues are not happening often enough today. We're all spending a lot of time talking with other people who agree with us, but finding the ways to talk with and, more importantly, listen to the people who may have different views is a real challenge. So I really welcome that opportunity when I get it. And I wanted to say, lastly, as part of this introduction, how much I really wanted to thank you all for listening to me and reflecting with me today. It's a real honor, actually, when people take time to think about your views. And I actually think the world would be a much better place if more people had an opportunity to be heard. It is a real honor to have other people spend their time listening to you. So very much looking forward to spending this day with you. And that is the end of the introductory remarks. So let's then begin by considering why it is so important in 2019 to talk about what I'm going to call fundamentalism and extremism, with, as I mentioned, the definitional discussion coming later. Why are these topics so relevant today? Now, this may be obvious, unfortunately, from the news, but just in case it is not a shared view that these should be priority topics, I thought I would begin by explaining my sense of just how important these issues are in the sort of universe of international human rights today. And I'm going to offer, as I said, a few examples from all too many that could be mentioned. So let me start with one tragic example. On March 15th of this year, as we all know, in New Zealand, a 28-year-old Australian man attacked two mosques, the El Noor Mosque and the Linwood Islamic Center in the city of Christchurch, killing 51 worshippers while they were at prayer. This bloodbath was not incidental violence. Instead, the perpetrator, whose name the New Zealand Prime Minister says she will not say, nor will I, the perpetrator, who broadcast the first part of his attack live on Facebook, clearly believed that he was implementing his own white supremacist manifesto, in which he, among other things, expressed admiration for the Norwegian terrorist Anders Breivik and the Charleston church shooter Dylan Roof. In the Christchurch attacks, one Muslim woman named Mariam Gul lost both of her parents and her brother. This was her entire immediate family gone in the attacks. And sort of to add to the horror of the tragedy, it was a strange coincidence that her parents were only in New Zealand on a family visit. They, in fact, didn't even live there. The people of New Zealand and many around the world reacted with horror and, I think, very dignified commemoration. And yet, just 1 month later, on April 21st, in and around Colombo, Sri Lanka, a series of coordinated suicide attacks targeted 5 Christian churches on Easter Sunday and 3 tourist hotels, killing 290 people and wounding 500, mostly Sri Lankans, but also dozens of foreigners. The attacks were carried out this time by a group called the National Tawhid Jamaat, a little-known radical Islamist group claimed to have a relationship with the so-called Islamic State, and were reportedly the worst attacks on Christians in South Asia in recent times. The site intelligence group, which tracks extremist activity online, said that an unidentified Islamic State supporter had distributed photos of 3 alleged, quote, commandos involved in the Sri Lanka attacks. In other words, these attacks as well were in no way sort of spontaneous or incidental. They were a part of carrying out an extremist agenda. The photos that were posted in pro-Islamic State chat rooms showed the men holding weapons in front of Islamic State banners, and they were described as, quote, among the commando brothers in Sri Lanka. In other words, very much part of this global jihadist network. Now, these so-called brothers, like the terrorist in New Zealand, destroyed actual families. The blast they triggered at St. Anthony's Shrine produced what one eyewitness called a river of blood. 20-year-old Naresh Danielson lost his parents and sister at St. Anthony's Church, now tragically, like Ms. Gould in New Zealand, being the sole survivor of the extremist slaughter of his entire immediate family while they were at prayer. From Christchurch to Colombo and beyond, extreme ideologies based on misinterpretations of race and religion are giving rise to violence targeting those seen as the other, reproducing the same human tragedy again and again in different contexts. And these cities were not alone in their suffering. I wish I could stop there. In the United States, as we've seen, white supremacists have just in the last year attacked Jewish worshipers on Passover in California and on the Sabbath in Pittsburgh, and most recently attacked immigrants doing their back-to-school shopping in El Paso. Buddhist fundamentalists, and yes, I said Buddhist fundamentalists. Some fundamentalists are more well-known than others. Buddhist fundamentalists elsewhere have promoted and participated in crimes against humanity against Muslim Rohingya in Myanmar, crimes rising possibly to the level of genocide in the view of UN experts. And Buddhists who have spoken out against the misuse of their faith to promote discrimination have faced grave repercussions. Hindu fundamentalists in power now in India have orchestrated mob violence against religious minorities and attacks on members of the majority who disagree with them, leading to a climate of increasing silence about abuses there. And I had a few Indian students this summer when I was teaching at Oxford, and I can tell you the level of concern that they feel about what is happening in their country is indeed very grave. I could continue. I could just spend the whole morning giving examples from around the world, from Hungary, from Poland, from Turkey, from the Philippines, from Brazil, and on and on. but I won't continue. I think what is clear is that we seem to be living in a moment of spiraling murderous hatred, a moment when expression of that hatred in many official circles is increasingly tolerated. This is a problem affecting this country, affecting the United States today. But I think we have to be very clear, it is not only an American problem. The American piece of the problem needs to be understood in the broader global context. This is a global challenge. We are seeing similar ideologies on the rise in different forms in literally every region in the world. And to this, we need not a piecemeal or selective response, but instead a truly global and comprehensive response. Different manifestations of fundamentalism and extremism, whether Muslim fundamentalism and Christian fundamentalism, or white supremacy and other forms of extremism, different manifestations of fundamentalism and extremism often reinforce each other through what Julia Ebner has called reciprocal radicalization. Diverse fundamentalists and extremists often use similar rhetoric, and though ostensibly enemies, they often actually have similar worldviews that are divided into us and them, each of those categories being assumed to be very monolithic. They often use the actions of the other extremists to justify their own and to gain support. So we really have to understand the interrelationship of the different manifestations of fundamentalism and extremism. And just to give you one example, it's an example I find particularly horrifying. After the Islamic State-inspired 2016 attack on the Pulse nightclub in Florida, the LGBT nightclub, which killed 49 mainly young people, some American Christian fundamentalists were found congratulating jihadists online, their hatred for one another superseded by their shared hatred of gay people. And this is an example of this kind of reciprocal radicalization, that these forces that sometimes seem to us like opponents, in fact, have very similar agendas, so that we really have to tackle this problem in a comprehensive way. It seems to me the clear lesson is that one form of fundamentalism or extremism is not a justification for another, ever. Each one is a reinforcing reminder of the global humanist crisis that lies before us. We must break out of this vicious circle that will leave youth globally facing a political landscape offering only a bleak choice of competing extremisms. Now, there have to be other choices. I think a big piece of this is making sure that it is always clear that there are other alternatives available. Another thing that has become very clear to me in looking at this problem at the global level is that there is no such thing as the clash of civilizations. There was this very celebrated book written by Samuel Huntington, The Clash of Civilizations, that tried to explain the world as being, in particular, in his view, a clash between the West and Islam, but just using this paradigm to describe relations between peoples in the world of a clash of civilizations. There is no clash of civilizations. But increasingly what we are seeing is a clash within each civilization around the world, between those who champion human equality and universal human rights within their own context and those who do not. Sometimes those who do not because of fundamentalist or extremist ideology. And I have to say that I am gravely concerned at the normalization of fundamentalist and extremist rhetoric in many political, cultural, and media contexts, in particular through its increasing embrace by mainstream or so-called mainstream political parties and candidates and elected officials. We're seeing this in North America, South America, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, Asia, and beyond. The immediate past United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, a man named Zeid Ra'ad Hussein, in 2017 denounced what he called the banalization of bigotry, and I think he was absolutely right. As a human rights lawyer, I believe that human rights norms should be used to constantly remind us of the unacceptability of these proliferating denials of human dignity. When Nazis are on the march again, you have to ask, have we learned nothing from the tragedies of the past. And it seems to me we've never had a greater responsibility than now to draw the clear lessons of the tragedies of the past. As I've already shown through the examples, extremist assaults on minorities and their cultural sites and practices have become widespread around the world, with the minority being targeted varying depending on the particular context. This has been recurring across Eastern and Western Europe, widespread and part of what may be crimes against humanity, as I mentioned, and even genocide in Myanmar, and rising clearly to the level of genocide at the hands of so-called hyper-extremists, such as the so-called Islamic State or Daesh. These acts are sometimes resulting in large-scale flight of members of the minority groups, which will impoverish the cultural landscape even more. We have to find ways, effective ways, to oppose such acts and the views that motivate them. Because again, as I tried to make the case, the acts are clearly based on the underlying views. They are not incidental. The violence is a symptom, the horrible symptom, and yet the underlying illness is the extremist and fundamentalist ideology, and that is what we have to tackle. And we have to tackle this in principle everywhere, not only when we feel a particular affinity with particular victims. Often people, based on sort of where they are on the political spectrum or based on their own identity, may sympathize with particular acts, with particular victims. What we actually need is a comprehensive response that reflects the unacceptability of this violence and this ideology, regardless of who happens to be the target of a particular act or a particular group. The lost families of Mariam Goul in New Zealand and Naresh Danielson in Sri Lanka are equally precious. And the point is that any such attacks are appalling. Again, I think for me, one of the key takeaways from today, I hope, is the idea that selective outrage and piecemeal responses are unhelpful at best. So this is one important contour of today's global landscape as I see it, and it requires our urgent attention and analysis, to which I now turn. Rising tides of fundamentalism and extremism in diverse forms, espoused by both states and non-state actors, represent major threats to human rights worldwide in literally every region of the world. They are growing challenges, and they have to be faced with urgency, and specifically using a human rights approach. While they manifest in a variety of forms, they often demonstrate commonalities. So let's look at some of those commonalities. What are some of the common themes and ideas that we see? At the heart of the fundamentalist and extremist paradigms, we find rejections of equality and of the universality of human rights, the idea that everyone has equal human rights simply by virtue of being human. So we find fundamentalists and extremists across the board rejecting equality, rejecting the universality of human rights, and that makes the defense of equality and the defense of the universality of human rights part of really the touchstone of the human rights response to these movements. When states undermine universality, they aid and abet extremism. And one particular example of undermining universality that I've been very concerned about lately is a new Trump administration initiative, which is called the Unalienable Rights Program at the State Department, which is designed basically to offer natural law as an alternative to universal human rights norms. And I cannot tell you symbolically at the United Nations what it will mean for the government of the United States to be officially championing natural law as an alternative option to universal human rights. This empowers many other governments that are seeking to reject universal human rights, and they can point to the U.S. example on this. When governments undermine universal human rights in this way or in many, many other ways, they aid and abet extremism. There are other common themes across fundamentalist and extremist abuses of human rights around the world. Such abuses often involve attempts at what I call cultural engineering, aimed at redesigning culture based on monolithic worldviews. The one thing I've found everywhere I go in the world is that the world and world cultures are never monolithic. There's often a sort of discourse of homogeny, and the reality anywhere in the world is always more complicated. So fundamentalists and extremists are often involved in cultural engineering, trying to redesign culture based on monolithic worldviews, often focusing on the idea of purity, the idea of enmity toward the other, and who the other is depends on what your context might be. They often try to police what they think of as honor and modesty. This has a particular impact on women. We'll talk about this later on today. They often claim cultural and moral superiority. They often are seeking to impose what they view as a true religion or an authentic or singular culture. Remember that Steve Bannon, one of the most interesting things Steve Bannon has ever said is that there is only one culture in the United States. I don't think he's ever traveled in the United States, if that's what he thinks. I can tell you, even my Ohio relatives and my Michigan relatives would think of themselves as coming from different cultural backgrounds. So this idea that there is only one culture, we often hear this. And we often see in the areas that I work on now at the UN, stifling attempts to sort of stifle freedom of artistic expression, which I will talk about in a moment, as well as to curtail scientific freedom in particular areas. So these are common themes that you find again and again across diverse fundamentalist and extremist groups. They are often trying to quash the expression of any cultural opposition to their own agenda. And in particular, if you look at the religious fundamentalists, they often have sought to punish cultural expression antithetical to their interpretation of religion, not to religion, to their interpretation of religion, in a range of ways, including through blasphemy laws, gender discriminatory family laws, campaigns of harassment against their critics, human rights abuses, and often outright violence. And diverse extremists across the spectrum often harass and target members of minority groups, immigrants, but also lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender persons as they seek to enjoy their human rights. And we're now seeing, of course, that many of these extremists are trying to prohibit the freedom of movement, sometimes of entire national groups, based on clearly discriminatory approaches. And I think if I had to boil all of this down into one common theme, it would really be mindsets based on intolerance of differences and pluralism, and efforts to stamp out cultural diversity and cultural dissent, which are such a key part of how human cultures evolve over time and how we experience them. So I've already been talking, I think, for about 20 minutes, if I'm counting correctly, and I've been using words that I haven't yet defined. So, as I know these are admittedly controversial terms, let me pause for a bit of a terminology check, and this may be something that we will discuss more in the Q&A. So, how do I understand these terms, fundamentalism and extremism? And I chose very much in my work to focus on the term fundamentalism in particular, and then that's in my writing, and then as a special rapporteur, I've also used the term extremism for reasons that I will explain. But let's begin with the term fundamentalism. Now, of course, many of you may know that this is a term that originated to describe a particular branch of Christianity in the 19th century. Some people, for that reason, feel that it's inappropriate to use it to describe other movements. But I can tell you that human rights defenders around the world who are working on these issues, and in particular women's human rights defenders, very often when they work in English do use this term. But note the S, fundamentalisms. I was told in the UN I couldn't use that because it was untranslatable, but I actually think the S is incredibly important because all too often we think about one form of fundamentalism, right? Or whatever the form is that is particularly stigmatized in the context that we are in, and that may be different depending on where we are in the world. But fundamentalisms, the S is a reminder of the fact that this is a plural phenomenon. We see many different forms of fundamentalism in many different contexts. And I very much like the definition that comes from an Algerian sociologist and feminist named Mariameh Eli-Lucas. And she writes that, as you see here, fundamentalisms are political movements of the extreme right, which in a context of globalization manipulate religion, culture, or ethnicity. I used an ellipsis there for part of that. Manipulate religion, culture, or ethnicity in order to achieve their political aims. And I like this definition for a number of reasons. One, I like the S, and I also like the fact that it really highlights the nature of many of these movements as political. So what the projects are actually about at the root are not spirituality, but about imposing one's own vision on other people by taking power either at the level of the polity or in society. So it's really a sort of, to use the words of Jessica Horn, who's done a lot of writing about Christian fundamentalism in Africa, it's a hegemonic project. So I like that aspect of the definition. And I also think it's important to think about the context of globalization. So when Mariameh first elaborated this definition, was in the 1990s at a time really sort of the height of globalization. And I think that that context really has an impact on the way that these movements have evolved. Sometimes they're seen as being sort of the opposition to globalization, a way of defending the local, supposedly, to use the famous book title, Jihad versus McWorld. But in fact, if you look at what is happening on the ground very often, fundamentalisms are often a form of globalization themselves that are about imposing a version of religion on local people that may be entirely different than what their lived experience has been of their relationship with religion. Just to give you one example, so when I was in West Africa, the women that I met, the women's rights advocates, were very upset that the local religious fundamentalists were trying to impose on women in West Africa garments that have never been worn in West Africa, garments that come from the Arabian Peninsula and bear no relationship whatsoever to their culture. So I think the relationship with globalization is very complicated. But I like this definition very much. And it reminds us that fundamentalisms have emerged out of all of the world's major religious traditions, including Buddhism, Christianity, Hinduism, Islam, and Judaism. And every time I think that I've somehow got the list to be an exhaustive list, somebody reminds me of another form of fundamentalism that I hadn't worked on before. So I met a Sikh feminist in the United Kingdom who was working on the problem of rising Sikh fundamentalism both in South Asia but also in the diaspora populations in the UK and elsewhere, and recently had someone from South Korea talking to me about problems arising within Confucianism. So this is a very sort of widespread, diverse problem. And fundamentalists across all these categories are involved in abuses of human rights. Given the religious claims that they make, religious fundamentalisms are especially difficult and dangerous to contest. It's always difficult to challenge any kind of form of extremism or fundamentalism, but you're on particularly dangerous ground when you challenge fundamentalism, because very often fundamentalists sort of make the case, claim that they are acting on behalf of the divine, and then you become the enemy of God, basically, if you are challenging them. So very, very dangerous work indeed to be involved in. But I want to make a couple of points that I think are always important, but perhaps especially important in this audience and for your group, given its focus. In each case, these fundamentalisms drawing from religion represent a minority phenomenon, distinct from the broader religious tradition itself, although drawing selectively from it. And what they offer is an interpretation of the particular religion, although they sometimes deny the fact that there is interpretation at all. There is simply the way, and that is what they are trying to purvey. So I want to make very clear, these are minority phenomena distinct from the broader religious tradition. No religion is inherently fundamentalist. I absolutely reject that idea. And nor should fundamentalist views be imputed to all the adherents of any religion. And to me, it's just a matter of principle whenever I talk about this issue to make that very clear. I don't want the critique of fundamentalism to be harnessed for other agendas. Another vital point to emphasize is that opposition to fundamentalism is not akin to an anti-religion stance. One can take an anti-religion stance, and that is part of the right of freedom of thought, and there is a strand of atheism certainly that does that. But opposition to fundamentalism is not the same thing. Both religious believers who do not conform to fundamentalist dogma, including many members of the clergy, and non-religious people, have often been targets of fundamentalist movements, and both religious and non-religious people have played important roles in the human rights struggle against fundamentalism. Fundamentalist groups, as I said, often seek to impose a politicized version of religion that is in fact quite alien to local populations. One of the stories in my book, a very religious man in Saudi Arabia came home and said to his daughter, what is this Islam that I've never heard about before? What is it that these fundamentalists are talking about? And very often what the fundamentalists are aiming to do is actually to eradicate the lived cultural and religious practice in local context. So very important to make this point, that both religious and non-religious people have been targeted by fundamentalists, and both religious and non-religious people have played critical roles in the human rights struggle against fundamentalism. So what about the term extremism? Well, in my UN work, I decided to employ that term alongside fundamentalism, in part because it plays a very significant role in UN debates, but also because I wanted to be able to talk about forms of extremism that do not draw from or claim to draw from a religious base. So I also used the term extremism to refer to those movements. Of course, it's tougher to define extremism. I think there's a bit more ambiguity in the understanding of that term, and the question of definition always has to be carefully considered and applied in accordance with relevant international human rights norms. We're now actually seeing a strange phenomenon in which governments are actually going after the opponents of extremism by labeling them as extremists. So, for example, in Malaysia, a country I visited not too long ago on an official mission, the government started referring to LGBT rights advocates as extremists who weren't much better than Daesh, than Islamic State. So this use of the concept of extremism against actually the opponents of extremism. So we have to think very carefully about how we use this term extremism. Some of the forms of contemporary extremism that have a particular impact on human rights focus on myths of a homogeneous nation, claims of ethnic or racial superiority or purity, and populist ultranationalism directed against liberal and pluralistic democracy, and indeed against human rights. And in my work in doing the research for the report that I wrote on fundamentalism and extremism, I found very helpful a set of indicators to aid in recognizing it that had been distilled from the work of social scientists by a gentleman named Alex Schmid, who had formerly been the head of the terrorism prevention branch at the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. And Alex Schmid, when he looked at the social science literature, sort of boiled it down into a number of key indicators for recognizing forms of extremism, some of the most relevant of which for our discussion today are that, in his view, quote, extremists tend to seek to reestablish what they consider the natural order in society, whether based on race, class, faith, ethnic superiority, or alleged tradition, are usually in possession of an ideological program or action plan aimed at taking and holding communal or state power, reject universal human rights, and show a lack of empathy and disregard for the rights of others, those who they consider to be other than their own people. They also reject diversity and pluralism in favor of whatever their preferred monoculture society is, and they portray themselves as threatened. There are many, many other indicators on his list. I won't read them all, but those are some that I think are particularly relevant for our discussion today. So the links between fundamentalism and extremism on the one hand and violent extremism and terrorism on the other also must be recognized, as must be the inherently dangerous ideas behind the violence. So for me, the problem is not just the violence. At the UN, there's a great deal of focus on what is called violent extremism without really wanting to look at the ideology. And I think the ideology is a critical part of the problem, and I will say throughout the day why I think that is the case and how I came to understand that. Now, some fundamentalist and extremist forces may pass themselves off as moderate. We hear this a lot, the so-called moderate Taliban. As an Afghan woman said to me, if someone is moderate, how could they possibly be? Why would they possibly be Taliban? And so you have this paradigm now that's been created at the international level where we talk about violent extremism, which suggests that there can be a so-called non-violent extremism. The problem with that is that that ideology may still have violent consequences. And so I think we also have to have a response to that. It may also have a very negative impact on human rights. And the underlying extremist ideology provides the ground on which the more militant extremists stand and provides the justification for abuses of human rights and indeed has a strong link to incitement to violence in the name of religion, thinking back to the anniversary that we just marked on the 22nd. So I think governments must not make the mistake of thinking that they can use so-called nonviolent extremism as a tool. And we've seen a lot of governments trying to do this. It is a very dangerous mistake. And the highest price for this kind of blunder is paid by women. Extremist actors will not be truly disarmed unless their ideology is comprehensively challenged and repudiated in accordance with international standards, and in particular through culture, expression, and education in accordance with international standards. And I think if you look historically in the UN system, this was clearly understood. So the connection between ideologies contrary to human rights norms and practices that violate them. That is why, for example, the UN didn't just tackle the abuses committed by the apartheid government in South Africa. It tackled the idea of apartheid itself, the idea of racial superiority itself, because these ideas are a part of the problem. While people do indeed have a freedom of thought, freedom of conscience, freedom to think and believe bad ideas, we have to challenge those bad ideas because those bad ideas may have very grave consequences for the human rights of other people. And I realize my time is rushing by, and I did indeed want to save time for discussion, so I am going to fast forward and skip a lot of material that is in here, to which I will hopefully be able to return later on in the day. But let me say a few more things in this morning's session before going to the discussion. What I hope will be very clear is that not only do I see fundamentalism and extremism as serious, urgent global challenges, but specifically that they are human rights issues with an impact on many of the human rights that we take for granted and to which we must respond using ideas found in the field of human rights. And that brings me to this question of what should we do about fundamentalism and extremism? How can we indeed respond to these problems as I have identified them? Well, I think there are many, many ideas that I could put forward in this regard, and I would suggest you take a look at my report for a longer explanation, which you can find on the website of my UN mandate, and I'd be happy to share that information with anyone during the break. But let me share a few of the ideas and a few of the recommendations here. One is that some things that we think of as luxuries may actually be critical tools for fighting fundamentalism. Things like arts, education, science, culture. I have to sort of explain to governments again and again why, when they think what they're doing is fighting fundamentalism or fighting terrorism, in fact, it is very important to fund arts, education, science, and culture, both because these things are incredibly important in and of themselves, but also because instrumentally they are a very critical part of responding to and really taking apart fundamentalist and extremist ideologies. They are a part of making space for peaceful contestation, promoting inclusion, protecting youth from radicalization. And I think of some of the amazing initiatives that I have heard about and been able to witness around the world. So, for example, in the Pakistani city of Karachi, which has experienced, unfortunately, a great deal of fundamentalist violence in recent years, there was a wonderful civil society initiative in the creation of something called the T2F Cultural Center. T2F just means the second floor. And this was a place where people could get together and take part in cultural activities, dance lessons, drumming, but they could also take part in discussions of things like the blasphemy laws. The point of T2F was to offer a space for a wide range of cultural and intellectual and political activities and to promote dialogue and tolerance. And its founder, Sabine Mahmoud, said, "You need that time and that engagement to hear out the other person as well as to present your viewpoint. You know, what may be obvious to you is anathema to the other person." And so she was so committed to creating that kind of cultural space for discussion. Now, very tragically, Sabine Mahmoud, the founder of T2F, was assassinated, in fact, by a jihadist who had attended one of the events in her cafe. But the amazing part of the story, in addition to her courage, is that that cultural center is still open. When she was assassinated, other people took up the task of keeping that cultural center open. And ask yourself, you know, would you have done the same? I think it's remarkably courageous act. But those sorts of initiatives, you know, I'm not saying it's an alternative to some of the more coercive measures that need to be taken, but I think those sorts of modest initiatives that seek to create space for dialogue are critically important as we try to respond with and through human rights to fundamentalism and extremism. One of the problems is that governments are often imprisoning or censoring or curtailing the activities of the very people who are standing up to extremists and fundamentalists, as well as failing to protect them. And all of that facilitates the rise of extremism. Instead, what governments have to do is ensure that there is a counterweight to fundamentalist and extremist discourses by publicly challenging them. Of course, that is impossible when the government itself espouses fundamentalist or extremist ideas, or the head of state does so either directly or in cryptic ways. So governments have a critical responsibility here. They have to stop supporting directly or indirectly fundamentalist ideologies. They have to protect everyone from the acts of violence by fundamentalist or extremist groups, or acts aiming at coercing them into specific identities, beliefs, or practices. But we also have to look at what non-state actors are doing. Very often, fundamentalist and extremist forces take the form of non-state actors, actors in the community, actors within religious institutions, and so on. And so we have to be really holistic in our agenda of challenging fundamentalist and extremist ideas in a very multi-directional way. One of the other things that we need to do is to listen to the local opponents of fundamentalism and extremism everywhere. They are out there, you know, whether it is the Southern Poverty Law Center in the South in the United States, whether it is some of the organizations that I will talk about in my second lecture who have been working to challenge Muslim fundamentalism. They have been out there working, in many cases for decades, against fundamentalism and extremism, sometimes battling those forces alone. And what's interesting to me is how rarely we listen to them at the international level. Suddenly, everyone realizes a little bit late that extremism is a problem and wants to rush in and provide solutions, but people don't bother to stop and actually listen to the people who have been on the front lines for years. And really, civil society plays, I think, a vital role in combating fundamentalism and extremism, in protecting human rights in the face of them. And they use many different strategies that we'll talk about later today. Strategies within religion, strategies outside of religion. I think of one wonderful group that I met working within religion, and this is Catholics for Free Choice, that is advocating for women's rights all across Latin America with a feminist interpretation of Catholic doctrine, and a really wonderful, innovative animated series called Catolicadas that I highly recommend. You can find it on YouTube, which is a series of cartoons involving dialogues between a cartoon character who is a priest and a cartoon character who is a nun, about sort of the shape of the church. And, that's a wonderful, very creative way of trying to engage in this debate. So we have to find ways to support all of the people who are taking this work forward on the front lines. There are so many things that we need to do. We need to understand fundamentalism and extremism, why they arise. I haven't had time to talk about that this morning. We need to understand how they take root in any given society and combat those root causes, including through the implementation of human rights norms, including in the economic, social, and cultural rights area. I think we need to be much more proactive, not wait until after there are horrific acts of extremist or fundamentalist violence, but look for the warning signs and take preventive action in accordance with international norms. And when there is clearly a problem, as is the case in the United States at the moment, and if we needed more reminding, the horror in El Paso should have made it absolutely clear. When there are clear signs that there is a very grave problem threatening the lives of many people, including many people in minority groups or other vulnerable groups, urgent action must be taken, and urgent action plans must be put in place by governments to respond. And clearly the United States is in that situation at the moment. And I think we need to come together as people and think about what that urgent action ought to look like. At the international level, I've also recommended a number of things. One is an international expert meeting on the human rights impact of all these diverse forms of fundamentalism and extremism, bringing together the frontline experts to discuss the best practice for responding. And it might be something that you could consider hosting in a sort of a non-official way here in this wonderful space of the Mountaintop Lectures in the future. I think we have to learn across these different experiences with fundamentalism and extremism. And despite what may be seen as a bleak picture that I've painted in this first lecture, or that you yourselves may see when you turn on the news, I really believe that it is not a moment for despair, but for hope based on concrete action. And I see hope, and I will come back to this again and again today. I see hope in those many human rights defenders, and indeed ordinary people acting around the world to challenge fundamentalism and extremism, sometimes doing so at risk of their lives. And I often think of a very brave young man, a so-called ordinary person named Ian Grillot, who was a young man in Kansas, who intervened and tried to stop a gunman who was spouting xenophobic rhetoric at his local bar in Kansas, and then tragically went on to murder a 32-year-old Indian engineer named Srinivas Kuchibhotla. And this xenophobic gunman, with his rhetoric, sadly was mirroring some of the rhetoric used by our current president in the election campaign. And Ian Grillot, this young man, though he was unarmed, tried to intervene, tried to stop this attack, and likely saved the life of another Indian engineer who was in the bar with Mr. Kuchibhotla. And I think we really have to take a great deal of inspiration from the idea of each individual, every ordinary person, feeling a sense of responsibility to step up in the face of extremist and fundamentalist rhetoric and attacks. And I always think of what Mr. Grillot said from his hospital bed. He didn't even have health insurance. He was gravely injured in trying to prevent the attack. And later on, actually, in the Indian community in his town, there was a huge fundraising campaign to support him, to support his medical bills. But from his hospital bed, he said, "I was just doing what anyone should have done for another human being. It's not about where he's from or his ethnicity. We're all humans." And it seems to me that is the spirit that we must adopt, that Mr. Grillot so clearly understood. I think the international community has to have the same courage that he had and has to stand together, because I really think that this is a wake-up call for our times. We are facing a multi-directional global avalanche of hate to which we must have an urgent global response. And I think part of that response is that we have to build and rebuild the culture of human rights and basic decency everywhere through effective, thoughtful, international law-abiding global action and within a universal human rights framework. And I thank you for listening so long, first thing on a Saturday morning. And I really look forward to your comments and your questions and to our ongoing dialogue throughout the day. Thank you very much. So I think that there is a microphone going around, and what I had suggested to the organizers, because you have listened to me now for a very long time, that we take a group of 2 or 3 comments or questions at a time, and then I will respond. And I think they're going to kindly turn the lights on so that everybody can see. Wonderful. Was there anything else that you wanted to say about how you'd like the Q&A to go? Okay. Please.
Yes, you had mentioned, used the term natural law without really explaining what that was. So if you could take a second and just share with us what it is.
Will do my best. Thank you. There's a question up here. Ken.
I was wondering if you would agree with my feeling that fundamentalists and terrorists have been much more effective in using social media as recruitment tools than people on the progressives, liberal side.
Thank you.
Even though you said you weren't dealing with why they are fundamentalists, can you give us some clues there?
Great. So wait, but would you like to take one more?
Sinclair Lewis, a writer, once said that when fascism comes to America, it will be carrying a cross wrapped in the flag. That looks back to 1933 when he wrote that, in the fascism and the Nazism that came to be part of our world at that time.
Great quote. So let me start with those. Thank you very much. What is natural law? That's a nice, easy question for a Saturday morning. No, it's a very important question. I think what will be interesting to see is precisely what those involved in this initiative within the State Department think is natural law. Given some of those who are involved, I'm likely to assume that they mean Christian-derived and specifically Catholic theology-derived ideas about inherent rights, which are not specifically not going to include things like the rights of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people, and specifically are not going to include certain women's rights, in particular in the sexual and reproductive rights area. I think that is the intent of that initiative, and I don't mean to generalize. Many other Christians and many other Catholics would clearly take a very different view, but I'm looking specifically at those like Secretary Pompeo who are involved in this initiative. And of course, the State Department has always had a very important Bureau of Human Rights, and I think the work of that office, which is so important, is potentially going to be undercut by this initiative. So we'll see what happens. I mean, I don't want to throw out natural law altogether. In fact, part of human rights, some would argue, is derived from some sense of natural rights, inherent rights, the idea that we all have inherent rights by virtue of being human. We are not given those rights by governments. We are born with them. And there's an ongoing debate about this, of course, in law. But the idea that you are going to substitute natural law, which is seen to be different from universal human rights, which those involved in this initiative claim are too broad now, have gone too far. That, to me, is an initiative that may have a very negative impact on the universal human rights framework, because note that other governments will want to throw out other aspects of universal human rights. And I think one of the points I would make if I had an opportunity to dialogue with those like Secretary Pompeo and others who were involved in this unalienable rights initiative is, think about the rights that you care about. So, for example, the rights of Christian minorities in other non-Christian parts of the world. What are you going to do when suddenly that is not seen as being derived from whatever the local version of natural law is? when you start throwing out universal human rights selectively, you've opened up the door for other people to do that and to make their own selection with impacts that you may really be unhappy with in the long run. So the social media question. This is such an important question. I'm going to talk a little bit about this later on in the day. Social media has clearly created some very important opportunities for people to challenge fundamentalism and extremism and to promote human rights. But it is also very clear around the world that fundamentalists and extremists have really targeted that space and have actually used it very, very successfully. I mean, it is amazing the way in which some of the manifestos, so for example, the manifesto of the New Zealand killer is all over the internet, that you can find horrifically, even some, if you look hard enough, the video of the first part of the broadcast of that atrocity. And so social media has really been something that the fundamentalists have used to broadcast their message. And I think the challenge is to find really positive ways to reply within that space. But it's also a dangerous place. So for a lot of the people that I write about, and I'll talk about this more in the second lecture, the internet has become a space where they are often threatened. Threatened. You have to be very careful on the internet. I think people often don't know this, for example, that if you tweet a photograph, the exact location of that photograph can be found out very easily. That is not my area at all. I didn't know this when I first started tweeting, and someone explained it to me. So I think what we have to do is really find a way to, while sort of respecting freedom of expression, to keep social media as a safe space and to really respond to threatening and bullying and trolling and so on. And the fundamentalists have been very active in that space. I just think about something that just happened. There's an Algerian journalist named Mohamed Sifawi who had to flee Algeria in the 1990s, something that I will talk about more in the next lecture, what happened in that decade in that country. And so he had to flee, and he now lives in France, and he is very active on social media countering fundamentalist messages and challenging jihadism. He survived an attack on the newspaper where he was working, and the friend who was sitting at his desk was killed because he had just stepped outside, and I think he's never gotten over that. And so he has really been campaigning very aggressively against Al-Qaeda, against Islamic State, and all of these groups on the internet, while he was targeted recently by fundamentalist trolls who started complaining about his posts and flagging them and tagging them, and he was then banned from Twitter. And there's now had to be an entire campaign to get him back on Twitter. So I hope, and I know there is some discussion of this, in particular since the New Zealand attacks, I hope that the social media organizations and companies will be really held to account in terms of what the impacts are of the way that the spaces that they have created are used. But I am sometimes frustrated at the selective response to this. So, people get very upset about a particular attack which especially offends them, and they want to talk about the ideology. And I find that, if people who are on the left seem to be particularly outraged, and rightly so, by white supremacist attacks, and when those attacks happen, they're willing to talk about ideology. But with the jihadist attacks, they don't want to talk about it so much because somehow it doesn't fit real well with their paradigm. And on the right, what you find is a lot of outrage about the Muslim fundamentalist attacks, and rightly so, and a willingness to talk about ideology. But boy, they don't want to talk about ideology when it comes to the white supremacist attacks in the West. And how do we transcend this kind of selective piecemeal response so that we're looking holistically at what these movements are doing on the internet to purvey their ideology? That is something I think we very much need to do. Why? That's the big question. Why are these movements arising? What are the factors that are propelling them forward? I think the answer is very much context specific. So it's hard to answer sort of globally, but I would hazard a few suggestions. I think that a lot of it has to do with education. In fact, when I wrote my book and I asked everyone that I interviewed who was working against fundamentalism and extremism, what is the solution to this problem? The answer I almost always got, sort of literally the first word out of everybody's mouth, was education. But I think fundamentalists and extremists have also in many places targeted education and affected the content of curricula. So that sometimes fundamentalist and extremist views of the world are actually being taught in various kinds of schools, religious schools, public schools, and other schools. And that really needs very much to be tackled. Sometimes fundamentalism and extremism arises in response to failures of government policy, whether it is failures of policy to guarantee human rights, failures of policy to guarantee economic opportunity. Sometimes I think it's promoted by the media. There's a big discussion now in India, for example, about what role the official and private Indian media is playing in spreading Hindu nationalist, Hindu fundamentalist ideas. I think that plays a very critical role. And I also think one of the real challenges is to create alternatives, to give in particular young people, other kinds of spaces and ways of organizing and ways of being together. I think that is critically important. I think with regard to the religious fundamentalist movements, part of the why has to do with the role that has been played by some clergy, which in some contexts has been very negative. Whether it is some Buddhist fundamentalist clergy in places like Myanmar and Sri Lanka who have been calling for violence against non-Buddhists, whether it is the role of some Muslim fundamentalist clergy in the way that they teach about jihad, the way that they teach about religious minorities, whether it is the role of some, and again, I always stress, some Christian clergy in terms of what they have been saying about other religious traditions or other faiths. I think that is critically important to look at. And so I mentioned Mohammed Sifawi in my answer to the last question. I remember interviewing him after the Charlie Hebdo attacks in France in 2015. And I remember so much what he said, that what we have to have is a holistic response. Yes, in some contexts, there may need to be a military response. Yes, there may need to be a law enforcement response. But we also need an education response. And we need, a health policy response. And we need an economic response, and we need a media response. We need really this multi-sectoral response because the causes in any different context are really multi-sectoral. They cross all of these different areas. And I think one of the first things that governments need to do in any given context is to figure out, why is this happening here? Why are young people being attracted by these movements? Why would young people be sort of susceptible to being convinced to lay down their lives in the course of massacring other people? And governments have got to assess that honestly and openly to be able to build the strategies that we need to respond. And I know there was an attempt to do that in this country. During the Obama administration, there was an attempt to do a serious report about the rise of white supremacy and far-right extremism, and it got shut down for political reasons. And now, actually, law enforcement in this country is terrified that the problem has gotten out of control because we let time go by without paying enough attention to what was happening. And completely understandably, there was a focus on jihadist terrorism, and yet we forgot, we lost the plot close to home. Meanwhile, there was this other terrorism and this other hateful ideology that was literally right here. And so now I think there's a lot of catch-up that has to be done to go back and understand the why. Why is this happening? And when we understand that, how can we build a strategy to respond? And thank you for the St. Clair Lewis quote. I think it is a great quote, carrying a cross wrapped in a flag, and I think it depends on the context. In other contexts, the fundamentalists, the extremists are using other symbols. And why do they do that? They do that because those symbols are so meaningful and so powerful, and because they think that if they wrap themselves in the flag and the cross or other places, the crescent and the star and other kinds of symbols, that they will not be questioned. And that's why I think it is so critically important to keep asking questions. We have time for another round. Any women out there like to ask a question? We had an all-male round first time around. Should we go for an all-female round? Not wanting to exclude anybody.
Thank you so much for your lecture this morning. It explained a lot of questions I had. But it brought up one that I almost hesitate to ask, but I think I've heard examples on the news of people who were pro-human rights, who were like bullying women who wanted to cover their heads because they were Muslim, things like that. What do you have to say about that?
Thanks.
My thoughts were. Am I on? Okay. In terms of trying to understand the rise of the fundamentalism and extremism, your thoughts on what that understanding is, because what I'm hearing is it's really a response. They're reacting based on a threat to them, to what they believe. So in terms of trying to understand what that is, your thoughts on what that underlying element is? For me, it's fear. They fear a loss of something or an inclusion. They're threatened by something. And would it benefit us to understand more about what that fear is in terms of how we respond to it?
Thanks.
What do you is it on? Okay. What do you think is the role of worldwide immigration in this rise of extremism and fundamentalism?
So we went with the easy questions before lunch, I see. These are all, thank you very much, very important and very challenging questions, and I'm conscious of the fact that my answers in the first round were long, but it is hard to do justice to such good questions in a short answer. You know, I used to be on CNN a bit when the book first came out, and the first time I was on CNN, they told me don't answer any question in more than 3 sentences, and it's actually very difficult to analyze any of these issues in less than 3 sentences. So I will do my best, and I'm happy to keep talking about this over lunch and as the day goes forward. As I know, we only have about 7 more minutes of this session. So let me start with the fear question. I do think that fear is a part of this and part of the motivating factor for different fundamentalist groups. But I also think that sometimes hatred is as powerful as fear. And while I do think that it is very important to understand where people are coming from and how it is and why it is that they're attracted to these ideologies, and to look, as I said, at the root causes, I also am sometimes anxious about root cause approaches that somehow suggest that there's always a legitimate grievance to which this is a response. I think that's sometimes the case, but sometimes I think that's sort of oversimplifying a little bit what is going on. So I think that fear and hatred are perhaps equally important. And when fear is a factor, I think there may be a number of different causes of that fear, some of which can include fear of losing power. I mean, I think about a case that I worked on very recently. I'm an incredibly brave young anti-slavery campaigner in Mauritania, because in some parts of the world there are still slavery-like practices being used. And this very brave blogger, Mohamed Mekatir, started blogging against the use of religious justifications for slavery and basically saying, please do not attribute slavery to the Prophet Muhammad. He wouldn't have agreed with you, in trying to revisit Muslim theology on the basis of a really anti-slavery interpretation. And for this, he was condemned to death for blasphemy in Mauritania. Then, after a lot of local organizing and international organizing in response, that sentence was commuted to a 4-year prison term, which he served, and then still was not released. And the government claimed that they couldn't release him because he was so much at threat, so much at risk of being killed by a non-state fundamentalist group when he got out. And I think clearly what was motivating those groups was partially fear of losing power, right? Fear of losing your place at the top of the hierarchy. So there may be fear of finding yourself at the bottom of the hierarchy sometimes, but there also may be fear of losing privilege. So even the fear itself may be very, very complicated. I'm glad to say Mohammed Mekatir is now out of prison, thankfully, and actually safely out of Mauritania, but still facing risk where he is. But I think one thing I completely agree with is the suggestion that we need to spend much more time understanding why these movements emerge if we're going to be able to design effective strategies to respond to them. The role of immigration, I think that is a very, very difficult question, and I want to be very careful and thoughtful about how I answer. I do think that we're now seeing this sort of tragic, complicated reality where people who are victims of fundamentalism and extremism in one place, like in Syria or in Iraq or in Afghanistan, flee to another region, such as Europe, such as North America, and then find themselves facing violence and threats from other extremists, now xenophobic, anti-immigrant extremists. And one of the things that I've always said is that we have to make sure that people who are fleeing fundamentalism and extremism at risk of their lives have the possibility of obtaining asylum and are protected from xenophobic attack in exile by other governments and by the international community, and that is critically important. And I think we do have to tackle xenophobia. We do have to tackle this idea of hatred of the other simply by virtue of the fact that they are supposedly different from us, and that this is something that should attract sort of loathing and not interest or a learning opportunity. I think we also do, though, have to create the space for people to be able to have a discussion about how they feel about immigration. I say this, I teach in Northern California. It's very difficult to even be able to have a conversation about what the impact of immigration might be and how we can, as a community, best respond to that. And I do think that it is very important to create the space for that discussion to happen. And when you think about a country like Germany that, took in 1 million people, there are a lot of conversations, I think, that people have to feel comfortable having about how that is going to change their lives for the better and maybe sometimes challenge their lives as well. And I don't think there's anything inherently racist or objectionable about people being able to express those concerns. So we have to confront racism and xenophobia, and we also, I think, have to give people the space to have a discussion about immigration. And the interesting thing about this, again, is that there is a global context to all of this. This isn't only happening in the West. I can tell you in North Africa, a lot of the activists that I interviewed about other things are now having to work to try to defend sub-Saharan migrants who are coming through North Africa on their way to Western Europe. They don't want to go to North Africa. They want to get to Western Europe, and that's the region that they go through. And they themselves, these North African activists, are now seeing the rise of xenophobia, in this case anti-sub-Saharan African migrant sentiment in North Africa, and they too are grappling with, how do we deal with this? How do we find a way to respond? And I think there too, it's really critically important to have a global discussion about this that is really looking at these challenges in the many different contexts. And so I've saved the last question, the veil-related question, for right before lunch, and it's a very, very difficult question. I think I would need sort of a half an hour to answer in full. What I would say is I think it is challenging to respond to the idea of somebody being pro-human rights but bullying someone who wants to cover their head. So I think I'd need a specific example of that exact combination of somebody who was, it's kind of an oxymoron that you would be pro-human rights and that you would do that. Nevertheless, what I would say is there is a very complicated debate going on about veiling among Muslims and people of Muslim heritage. And I think in the West, we often generalize about this from various political points of view. And one of the most important things that I think that I would say is how vital it is that everyone understands that there is absolutely no agreement that covering your head is required by Islam. Anybody who says that has basically bought into fundamentalist propaganda. And people on the right and on the left, I hear this in human rights circles, there is absolutely no agreement that it's required by Islam. And in fact, a generation ago, most women did not cover. And I am equally concerned with rising pressure on women in many contexts. I mean, this is happening in other non-Muslim contexts as well, rising pressure on women to cover themselves, to hide themselves, not to be in public, and so on, and to cover themselves in more and more extreme ways. And I am also very concerned about discrimination against women who do cover in other parts of the world, in non-Muslim majority parts of the world, and very often those women, because they are seen as being sort of easily identifiable as Muslim, are really bearing the brunts of a lot of the xenophobia and the hatred. But I think we have to be very careful in how we respond to this. So, for example, after the New Zealand attack, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, as we all saw, covered her head. Now, most Westerners that I know thought this was wonderful. And the Muslims and people of Muslim heritage that I know were very strongly divided about this, because on the one hand, some people appreciated it as a gesture of solidarity and empathy, which is, I think, and respect, which is, I think, the way that it was meant. But there's also a huge struggle going on. For example, at the moment, there is a big protest movement in Iran of women going out in public and taking off their headscarves and being sentenced to very long jail terms for this, because they don't want to cover their heads. So I think the challenge is, you know, how do we respect the human rights of people who dress in different ways, and how do we understand the human rights meaning of pressure on women from fundamentalists and from others in terms of how they dress? And I think that's a very complicated question maybe that we can return to in the last lecture. And I thank you so much for these great questions and for your attention. And I think I need to hand over to the moderator. Have a very good lunch.